I would like to say a few words about our roundtable panel today. At the core of Call to Men is the signature analysis on the collective socialization of manhood, the men box, and the community organizing model for promoting healthy manhood. I am honored to introduce the members of this panel. Afua Addo, who brings expertise on court innovation and the impact of trauma on Black women's criminalization and victimization related to historical resilience. Jesus, Chucho Ruiz, who intentionally answers calls to meet the needs of the Chicana community and works to create intertribal relationships, and has worked intentionally in engaging men and boys through his work. Jane Ralph, who moves in social and racial justice spaces without centering whiteness or herself. You can count on her to show up, to follow, to partner, or to lead. And Lina, my sister, Lina Juarbe Botella, community organizer who addressed intersectional oppression. Lina embodies the work of healing and transformation. Please join me in welcoming this beautiful panel.
I just went ahead and unmuted myself. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. Hello, everybody. I wish I could see all your faces, but I got to look at those pictures and see the community and the space that you're in. And a big shout out to whoever was jamming, whoever was your DJ. I feel like we should get up and move, everybody. So we appreciate being here. We're super humbled to be here as a team. You know, we bring you all greetings from the entire team of A Cult to Men, particularly Tony and Ted. We are in love and in relationship with the California Partnership. We love that we are in working together through all that we have done over the years. We come to you with lots of love, with a tremendous focus on community, and for undying commitment to our peoples. We have been in a journey really with the California Partnership, and actually important to mention with Policy Link and the Alliance of Men and Boys of Color over the past, it's been 3 years now. We are here because we want to expand what's happened in the conference already. We really want to continue to shift the lens and frankly expand the lens and really be intentional about how we get that lens into focus. And frankly, very unapologetically. We're living in an incredibly historical time. We are all breathing a lot of painful experiences, keeping it real. And we are witnessing a great divide amongst our people. Really, our humanity is in question. Part of what brought us here is that last year, A Cult to Men actually participated in the conference. And you might remember that there was an interview that Tony did with Ray Rice. And following that, we had 3 incredible advocates from the state of your state, of California, 3 Black women, really share undeniable truth from their perspective about what the Black community wanted, needed. And some of the feedback that was received by the coalition, I think it's important to bring it to the space right now. In this moment where we don't have a lot of time because we have a lot of urgency in this moment, we all have to risk. So some of the feedback that was received pretty consistently from the attendees to the conference was, why didn't you tell me ahead of time that this conference was going to be focused on Black people? They actually called it the Black Conference. Some folks did. Stay with me if you get tight. Stay with me if you're having a hard time as you hear this, everybody, all right? You know, it's interesting because really that response almost predicted the moment that we are in this moment right now, and why we're back, and why we're so humble that the coalition, that the partnership immediately said, can you come back? We need to stretch ourselves even more. At the end of the day, collective liberation is at stake. We're here to share with you what we believe the movement, the field needs to hear. Let me tell you, first, most I hold many identities, but one of them is as a hardcore advocate. I don't care where I'd be working, I'd be an advocate. They're the dopest people in the world, if you ask me. We can always do something with nothing, and we can bring love and healing to anything that we touch. I want you to know that this is a conversation. This is not going to be a huge train of slides and a huge, this is going to be a non-linear, complex and beautiful conversation at which, frankly, none of us here have even arrived, because we never arrive in this process, but we have remained unapologetically committed. We have 45 minutes to do this, and we will not be able to be finished. So please know that we're going to leave unfinished, but we are certainly leaving you and ourselves, because we need to be accountable as well. We are leaving us all with a challenge into action and to do, and more importantly, if we can, to be. I introduce again Afua, Jane, and Chucho. I know that you all probably have the long intros of them. They're incredible folks, but to me, these are the folks that radically um, help me stay committed, help us at a Call to Men never lose sight of the possibility of collective liberation. If I'm being honest, I've had moments over the past year whether I've been asking myself whether that's possible. But I believed in it since I was a little girl. So these folks have held up that dream. And we want to tell you 3 undeniable truths. Miranda, can you help me with the slides, please? I can't, yeah. Can you go to the next one, please? We want to offer you 3 undeniable truths. Go ahead, Miranda. Press it one more time, please. We come to you boldly to remind ourselves or to stretch ourselves that we cannot do any anti-sexist work without being committed to anti-racism work, that they have to be intrinsically connected. Miranda, click it again. We must expand our anti-racism lens. We're here to tell you we don't think that's enough anymore, that we have to center the margins of the margins. So what does that mean for us? We are really talking about that we must assure that Black women, that Black trans women are at the center of that as we do this work, because it is the only way we can all find our liberation. Go ahead, Miranda. That we must center and shout from the mountaintop, anti-Blackness, anti-racism is no longer enough, as I said. And that we also must challenge the erasure of Indigenous peoples everywhere. And lastly, Miranda, that we must dismantle white supremacy culture. We must do the anti-racism, not deep enough. And lastly, number 3, Miranda, is that we're here to talk to you about sharing power, about not just sharing power, but giving up power. All right? I'm going to start with you, Afua, as we go into this conversation. And when you hear me say we can't do anti-sexism work without also doing anti-racism work, what comes up for you?
Well, thank you very much. And is there an echo or you can hear me just fine? Okay, good.
Perfect.
Well, I must acknowledge first that it's always great to be in company with this crew. I really appreciate the preparation for this. Our time together included a few conversations and a few sidebars and tangents, because that's the way that's the only way to approach this. It's not, there is not one level set, one language, one foundation. It's many identity dynamics happening at once. And so I think when we first started talking about this, I took us all the way back to 1827, when Sojourner Truth presented her speech, Ain't I a Woman? And it truly challenged the idea, that white supremacy was the only driving rhetoric and ideology for establishing democracy in these continental United States. It also challenged the absurdity of the binary, the gender binary and the sexual identity binary. If you delve deep into it, it's highly, and with a lot of scrutiny and like really get in the weeds of what she's saying, that is almost impossible to consider power and control in this country without looking at the ways in which we perceive one another, how we just look at one another and make judgments, and based on tropes, stereotypes, and ongoing theory, mistheory, and miseducation become a part of the very essence of our daily interactions with one another. We're at a point now where we are afraid. We're afraid to center the liberation of our neighbor if they do not look like ourselves, or if they do not look the way society tells us certain individuals are supposed to. And based on our proximity to power, we believe we are in a position to correct what it is that is presented before us. So I'm gonna start going deep into different channels if I keep going with this, but I think it's safe to say, and I don't want to make assumptions that everybody on this call knows all of the terms and the history, et cetera. I think it's safe to say that Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality is paramount to our experience, that for women of color, for Black women for whom that identity is not salient to them, intersectionality begs the question of or it gives us agency, I should say. It gives us our ability to talk about, to center, to refer to push back and protest for, to advocate for all of our shared identities. It's the very reason, Lina, that at the beginning you were able to talk about your identities and not have to make that choice before you open your mouth. You didn't have to validate the truth that was coming out of it, because we can see you, we are working through and looking at you through that lens. So I'm gonna fall back now.
Thank you. Chucho, as you hear Afua's thoughts, what are some of the thoughts that you would also want to highlight as we continue to expand this lens?
Good afternoon, everyone. Natoka Chucho. Yeah, and listening to Afua talks, it just, for me, what comes up for me is part of like my personal journey in like gender justice work. And then, like part of that invitation of like having to do my own work because of like my own privileges. But I remember reflecting on it, thinking about I was willing to show up and learning about patriarchy and the impacts of patriarchy. But one of the things that I was struggling with is like how I was complicit in that. And I think, part of that, what we know now is that this need of vulnerability to be able to figure that out. And what made it really challenging for me was doing accountability work where I had to be vulnerable, where there was white men facilitating that space. And so like for me, I was like not having that. It even made me like not want to show up for that even less. And there's like a lot of nuances in that, because I was like, I'll do this work if I could do this with just men of color. you know, and feeling kind of guilty and some shame about it. And then like reflecting on it, coming to a realization that like, no, I just need to do this work. I can't wait till it's like catered to me. There's like a sense of urgency. But then also in that, in my journey was that reflecting on it later is like why I needed to do that work also was that I could be like a man of color to like my brothers, right? That maybe were having the same challenges that were coming up for them, and that weren't, you know, for whatever reason, based on our experiences, the different experiences of trauma and violence that men of color have experienced, people of color have experienced. I think that's you know, for me, I think it was a way that I could develop my own, you know, skill sets to be able to reach out to my brothers. Um, yeah, so that's kind of like, you know, for me, when I think about it, you can't really do one without the other, right? And so that was a lesson learned for me, definitely.
I love that. I love that. I love hearing you say we can't do one, you can't do one without the other. But if I'm going to be the boldest version of myself, I believe that many people in that movement have been doing one without the other.
Mhm.
And that actually brings me to, you know, Jane, you know that I'm talking about white people predominantly, and people have positions of power. So I'd love to hear your thought and reflection. And Afua and Chucho, you all jump in with each other as we need to. This is not a panel. This is us having a community discussion. We're in a gathering together. Even though I can't see all the faces, I know you're all beautiful people, and that's why you're here. Jane?
Yeah, white institutional leadership, absolutely. Within this movement and with any movement we've managed to take, steal the lead in, we've assumed we can do it one way, a white way and an anti-sexist way without paying attention to the intersectionality that Afua talked about. I think white women in particular in the women's movement assumed that there was a common women's experience. And then were surprised when women of color didn't want to come and be like people who look like me, couldn't do that. And yet, of course, that common experience is not true, because if it was, then white people would not have responded last year the way they did. They would have recognized that when it's centered on women of color, when it's centered on Black women's experience, there's something for me to learn here too, that it doesn't have to look like me for it to be what it needs to be. And that's gone through the whole movement, through the history of the movement, and especially when the movement became a field where it was built on the backs of women of color. The most critical work was being done by women of color, the best work was being done by women of color, and yet they remained in advocate roles if they got paid at all. And yeah, advocates are great. They absolutely are the backbone of the movement, but they don't end up leading the movement. People who look like me end up moving up in the institutional leadership. And that's got to change. That's part of why we have to be committed to anti-racism work along with the anti-sexism work. And I love that it needs to not just be male, female, gender. It needs to go much deeper than that.
Absolutely. Afua, Chucho, would you like to add any jewels to that or talk to each other?
Well, you know, I so appreciate, Jane, that you say it doesn't have to look like you to be important and relevant, but unfortunately, so many people do believe that, right? Like if it doesn't, so many people believe that and so many people don't. And that's why we do have, but even though, right, even though that doesn't have to be true, I do want to acknowledge what happens with benevolence over times, over the years,
Totally.
what happens when we try to help, to support, to provide leadership or resources to impacted communities, defunded or underfunded communities or disenfranchised communities. What has evolved, and we again, we can talk about this forever, but we won't today, but what has evolved is some of the system issues we have in like social work, foster care, child protective systems, and education, all the way into, you know, the legal system. So I do want to acknowledge that sometime, right, and that conversations like this are crucial, so that we don't get in, so that one does not get in their own way, so that the very supremacy or the very racial and gender power differences don't cloud that tendency to support others that look different than you. Because one of the things that has been perpetuated in this country is we can help people as long as this is the metaphor I'm going for here is we can help people as long as my foot is on their neck, or as long as I'm leveled up above them in some kind of capacity. And I think that has to be taken away from how we support one another, right? The way Chucho talked about being an ally, a male ally, and seeing women across lines of race and other lines of difference.
I think you're right, and I don't think it's going to change until people who look like me are just as willing to step into that discomfort, step in to make the hard decision that Chucho made, to step in despite it being led just by white men. Until we're willing to step in that same way, we're not going to have the systemic change that we need. It will change individual lives, and that's good, but it's not enough.
Chucho, you want to lace any other part?
No, not at the moment. You know.
That's all right. I love that part that you said, Chucho, when you talked about taking, like you could have just checked out. Isn't that true even our own healing, everybody? There's so many times that I could just numb up or check out for my own healing because of the discomfort, right? Sometimes I'm sitting here just trying to be fully present because this rubs off, connects, right? And so we really are just trying to create an invitation to have the complex conversation that we're having. But if we continue to wait to get it all perfect, if we continue to wait to get it while there's no discomfort, when was the last, I can't see all the advocates in this room right now. When's the last time that you had a survivor who didn't show up to you with some level of discomfort and pain? And let us not forget that if we're feeling uncomfortable and feel rubbed upon, we are all, many of us are employed and receive a paycheck because somebody is in pain in our community. These are not just our clients, everybody. These are our peoples. And we must expand that. You know, I'm hesitant to use the word risk. I think we say that a lot, right? Like we must risk. I just think you got to do it because it's the only way for collective liberation. Because I don't want to say thank you, Jane, as a white person, because you're doing what you ought to be doing. I don't have to thank you for showing up. You're supposed to be showing up, right? Afua, did you want to add something? I kind of feel it.
Yes, and because I think that we do have to show up, we do have to push through and be present. But I think the burden, the toll it can take is real, and we have to pay attention to that. And I think in this moment, in 2020, let's talk about what's going on in America right now. Why not? How do you work with one another when people are both showing up and, both doing the work and being the work? And I think we have to be mindful of what we ask our staff, what we ask our personnel. In the capacity, the consulting capacity that I work in with executive leadership, I've been very candid how it feels to be asked, almost independent of the world's and the country's issues, to meet deadlines, to turn cameras on, to show up for meetings, to be professional, to then educate other staff about all the 450 years of history that we've been miseducated about, then to act appropriately, to play nice in the sandbox, and then to go home and do that for family and for friends. Where is the solidarity in this? If you are managing staff of color, if you're managing Black staff, listen, years ago when I was managing staff working in the legal system, and I had court-based staff, if I had staff that were Black or that shared affinity, because I also had trans staff, and if an individual had been murdered, harmed, their crime was highlighted and became salient, for some of my staff, they weren't required to come in the next day. How am I going to require those individuals to come back into a courthouse where then they have to walk past their own colleagues, their own coworkers who are armed white men? That's inappropriate. It's an inappropriate ask. So I think about not just what we do in this work, what we ask people doing in the movement, but how are we advocating for this in other areas? How are we protecting our well-being? Because the fight's not over after this election's done. This is when it begins. And what are we modeling if we're constantly talking about being in the fight and doing the fight, but we don't talk about where rest is and where like alleviating pressure on one another is, then we're not helping anybody. Essentially, I just want to point that out because a lot of the work that I do, in addition to my job, is just supporting people who can't push back against the supervisor or against the colleague, or who still don't want to show up as looking like a lazy Black person, or the Black woman who's late to a man. Let me tell you, I'm late to meetings. I'm late. I'm late all the time, and I'm happily late. Right, a call to men, my friends at a call to men. And I say I'm going to be late. It's exercising. It's shaving off a little bit of that anxiety by saying to myself, it's okay to do that. I'm going to have to do that just to self-soothe and calibrate.
You know, I think that's so important to hear, because when I've done work with coalitions, especially in this field, when I've done work with individual programs, white women assume they get to take the next day off. They assume if it's been a hard conversation, they don't have to show up for the next hour. They assume that if they're in a conversation like this, that it's not the gift that it is, that it's actually something that is hurtful. And it's not. This is a gift. Hearing you speak that honestly, I don't get that many places in my life, because people don't talk to white people like that. And that's got to happen. That's got to happen, because, you know, we may not take care of ourselves well, but we give ourselves permission to do that, and we give other white folks permission to do that.
Jane, thank you for hitting that on the head. Can I just say something? I'm really gonna fall back. This summer, I had an experience with a client, or working in a capacity where all women working together, mixed women, white women, Afro-Latino, African, all, you know, diverse pool of women working together. The individual managing the team was a white woman. Brilliant, we've worked together for years. I have no issues advocating for myself to my colleague. However, part of the policy of this team was if you needed to take a break, you didn't have to go through the proper channels, or like emailing everyone. You just took the time off if you needed to, right? So pay attention to what happened. I'm speaking to women who are of color, and one Afro-Latina woman who is a mother of a toddler, working and parenting and teaching from home during this quarantine. It expressed to me stress. And I said, you should take off. In my capacity, in my power, I said, you can take off the rest of the day. And I think tomorrow you're fine to just kind of just chime in when you can. And she said, yeah, I know. So listen to that. She knows what the policy is. Yeah, I know. But my anxiety can't let me do that. When I spoke to the manager in charge of this team, and I said, I would like you to institute the Friday off, because people are not going to be comfortable, based on their proximity to power and their experience and history working in these settings, with just taking it. And I've noticed that white women on the team just took the day off, just sent an email and said, next Tuesday I won't be around. It was hard to work with a colleague, someone I'd worked with so long, who was missing that, who couldn't catch the nuance of what was happening there. But I really had to stress that regardless of what the policy is, regardless of what the rule is, doing this work requires you to push that envelope a little further and acknowledge how power and control dominates based on our identities, based on who we are, or where we believe we're supposed to be, or act. And so even if you have a policy in place that you believe is equitable for all people on your team, or you have an open door policy, just keep in mind that the history of this country doesn't indicate equity. And so one isn't going to just learn it because you say it. I know it's hard to hear, and it was hard to navigate in that moment, but I said, we're going to have to institute something whereby everyone just has off without inviting people to take that time off, because traditionally folks are not going to step up and advocate for themselves, because oftentimes our needs and wants and desires are weaponized against us.
Right, it's that boot on the neck.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I hear all that. Give me a second to kind of put a second layer, right? So we're saying you must be anti-racist, right? If you're going to be doing gender-based violence work. But what we're also saying as a call to man, as a human beings, is that we must also go deeper. You can no longer be the person who's, oh yeah, I'm anti-racist, right? We're saying that you can no longer be a feminist without being a Black feminist, right? We're saying, because feminism, I grew up saying I'm a feminist. And then I got it and I was like, oh my God, I've been part of the problem, right? If we would have been listening to Black women in the 1960s, we would not have created shelters that remove women from their house after experiencing violence. We would have been loving the men in their lives and saying, let's wrap around you and love you and support you and create a different possibility, right? Because the men in our communities, particularly those that reside at the margins, they're not disposable. And they are not garbage. And I'm sorry that creates some great confusion for the criminal justice system. They're over-serviced in all these pieces.
Yeah.
So we want to go deeper. Chucho, as I'm saying that, anything you want to add around that? And then I think I heard you, Afua, wanting to say something. So now we're saying we must be we be really centered around anti-Blackness. We must be very centered around calling white supremacy culture what it is, those habits of white supremacy that are killing us all. So we want to layer that and open to everybody. Anyone?
And not allowing for the erasure of indigenous people, because basically, you know, either the people were stolen or the land was stolen, and it was stolen by a white system that said, we deserve this. And Chucho, I know you have a great story about that. If you want to tell it.
No, definitely. When I think about this, I definitely, I feel like it's into this idea of like an understanding white supremacy and knowing that from the beginning, from the stories of our ancestors, right? Like there's just the audacity of us not being seen as human beings, as civilizations, thriving societies, right? The audacity of being a people that were discovered, or land that was discovered because, you know, we weren't seen as humans, right? So like just that point of reference of a colonialism that it trickles down and is still having its impacts, right? Because of all the policies and all the, you know, whatever was established then, how it's still impacting us today. And the standards and all things is whiteness. The lens, the expectations, the perspectives, all of whiteness. And that in itself is perpetuating erasure, right? And you see it generations later, right? So it wasn't just at the time of their arrival, but generations later with the ways that were mislabeled, mischaracterized. You see it on CNN, you know, being referred to as something else as opposed to like indigenous peoples. And that's happening right now, right? And when we think about the land that we're on, right? Like whose territories we're on, right? And I know there's more effort around land acknowledgement, right? But it's also acknowledging the people, you know, the stewards of the land and our relationships to the land that go back thousands and thousands of years of lived experiences, of our languages, of our practices, in comparison to this language that I'm speaking now, that is very new, that is still, you know, foreign to a lot of us, you know. And then we have our genetic memory, right? That is not jiving with white supremacy, right? As we, you know, as we continue to navigate that. But I just think about, and then even our experiences as indigenous peoples in that colonization process to that forced assimilation, right? As a mode of survival, right? And I think about even ways that we, when we're talking about anti-Blackness, and the ways that we as Indigenous peoples, right? And I can't speak for all Indigenous peoples, but I know that in my community and the local tribes here from where I'm at, I've experienced anti-Blackness as a result of the collective socialization of how we're taught and how it's embedded in our society, right? So just, you know, that proximity to whiteness, right? And like really witnessing and experiencing those things in Indigenous communities and in other communities of people of color. And how do we continue to do work that has always existed in terms of solidarity, right? How do we continue to do that work and lean into that work? But that's definitely something that's just kind of like what shows up for me is it's just a reminder, right? Like that we're not seen, we're being silenced, but how is it that we could continue to share our stories, share our songs, our war cries, because we're still here, you know. And this for me is an opportunity, right, to be able to acknowledge and recognize, the sisters of my community, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, because we're often forgotten about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chucho. I know that we have about 10 minutes left. I said it before, I'll claim it again. We are going to be completely unfinished. Part of our hope is that we are all creating bolder spaces. The other thing is that we can't secure safety. Some people is like, oh, we're going to create safe space. I love safe space, everybody. But these type of conversations that really need to happen, you risk some of yourself and safety in it. And so we are hoping that we create brave spaces where we can, and that we stretch and that we come back, all at the same time. In the 10 minutes that we have, I'm going to lay one other thing, and team, we all do whatever we want to do. Afua, you say whatever you want to say.
Sure. There is a question from the chat about what one does when leadership fails to acknowledge. I'm sorry, not even that. This actually reads, what is your suggestion when the very people in power in our organizations make excuses for racism? And I'm looking directly into this camera to tell you that it is a big problem. If a person is excusing racism, they are telling you they are racist. I don't know what else to say. That is like saying, well, she shouldn't have had a short skirt on. And so maybe there is some gaslighting, but if someone out and out says, well, the reason why, the reason why we drug test individuals who work in this level of work at this organization and not everybody else is because they're recently released felons, et cetera, and they can out and out justify that, then they're telling you exactly what the belief is. I think that in and of itself is telling us that we know we have problems. We know people have ideas. A lot of times, the reason we can't have this conversation is because people really fear being called a racist. They can't hear that word, right? But they need to know that they're not good at relationships. And so what I've started to tell people now is that you have not been properly socialized, right? Because I am interacting again with white men who have to hear things come out of my mouth and believe what they are. And so none of us have been properly socialized. We've all been convinced that race is real, that racial categorizations are real, racial identity is real, but there is no scientific evidence for the categories. We know 2 layers below this skin, come on, scientifically, like what do we find following here? But our identities are real, our experiences with one another. Real quick, Lina, I'm just going to drop this jewel and get on up back. Toni Morrison says in her recent the movie that was released before she passed away, Peace as I Am. And at some point in it, she says, if you know the history of Black women, then you'll know the history of America. And if you pay close attention to what she's saying there, look at the relationship between Black women, Black community, and Native and First Nations communities. It's so fractured, it's so disunified, similar to that with Latino, Hispanic, Caribbean peoples, the diasporas, and then look at the expanse of anti-Blackness. I don't have to have ever been in a remote village in like the Russian steppe. But the minute I get off a plane there, I guarantee you they know exactly what stereotype to come at me with or to ask me whether or not I know Beyonce and like her or not. And I think that we have to be very mindful of what's real and what's not real.
And I know this might sound crazy, but when people tell you something, maybe you want to believe them. We certainly get clearer about that when we're talking about survivors of violence. And let us not forget that racism, anti-Blackness, it's all violence.
Very violent.
And somehow we cannot disassociate from that.
Well,
right?
there's some studies on that. So if you want more information on that, please feel free to email me. But a lot of disassociation and primarily because of how we so I would say when I say social media, I'm not talking about the internet. I'm talking about everything that came social media before then, the vaudeville and entertainment that was traveling caravans and circuses all the way up into television, right? That all of that perpetuated very strong stereotypes, ideas, right? Disney and Warner Brothers, right? Perpetuated these dynamics. It's almost impossible. How I describe this to people, I say it's like trying to describe the flavor of salt to someone who has no tongue. As I'm trying to describe the ways in which supremacy permeates this experience. And let me, and oh my gosh, we have like
hold on, let me say something and then we'll come right back. We'll figure it out. It reminds me of the fish in water, right? A fish that doesn't know it's a fish. It reminds me of that. Let me put this other layer because I want to make sure that we all get a moment to particularly scratch the surface boldly around, and I want to go straight to you, Jane. What I want to say is that we have to learn how to give up power, not just sharing it. We have to move beyond, like, what is it called? Diversiveness and inclusion and all that stuff. Talk to us about what your thoughts on that as a white person.
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, I hate the euphemisms of DEI. We won't even say them. We won't even go through saying the actual words. We make them into an acronym. But it's about white supremacy. And the problem with asking white people or white people saying we're going to share power is, first of all, we never learned how to share. We don't share at anything other than a kindergarten level. And it's really a quid pro quo when we're trying to share. So that breaks down immediately. Sharing is not possible. Giving up power is what needs to happen. And because white people tend to think of power transactionally, we can't really fathom what that would look like. It needs to be whole cloth giving up of power. It needs to be recognizing we have to give up cultural power, systemic power, power to tell the history, all of that. And if we only think of it at that transactional level, then we only think about what I do, not what we as white people do. It's still important for me as an individual to give up power. But if that's the only thing that happened, if every white person in this conference who has a position of power in the movement quit today and left, chances are tomorrow someone who looks exactly like them would get hired. So the simply changing personnel won't do it. It has to be changing the system. And so when we talk about giving up power, it's giving up the power system that we've created to benefit ourselves and to provide a negative impact on people of color. I get tongue-tied when I talk about this because it's scary and it's real, and yet I know my own liberation depends on it. I will not be free unless it goes this way.
I'm doing this. That's a great mic drop. I do have to say, I kind of love hearing white people say things like that, Jane. I wish it was more common. I wish I wouldn't feel, I'm feeling kind of like, wow.
Yet when I leave this conversation, it's so easy to forget. The forgetfulness starts happening immediately. It's like plaque growing on my teeth. It's the same thing.
we always say, right, that we talk about aspiring allies. I'm kind of down more now with the idea of co-conspirators, you know, because that implies you have to show me that every time.
Right.
Like you don't get to decide. Like I don't get to decide I'm an aspire and I'm an ally to to Black people. Like I don't get to decide that. I show that by my actions, right? And it's actively. I never arrive, and I always have to grab it and get it. But co-conspirator speaks more to me. Chucho, did you want to add something? I saw you nodding over there. We need like a red button or something for me to know that you're like, I'm in it. Let me say something.
I think we have like 2 minutes or.
I'll try to drop. I'll try to drop a jewel. I just want to say, like, when I think about giving power, I think it definitely it needs to be giving power as opposed to sharing power, because I feel like in when we think about power in white supremacy, it's a lot of like the authority, right, or this sense of expertise, right, and again, like the audacity of like being an expert in the lived experiences of other people, right? Like how could you be an expert, right, and when they're in any of these matters when there's so much ignorance, and I don't like, I mean ignorance in the sense of just the lack of experience, right? So I just think like we need to be able to give folks that power that have their own lived experience, right, their own expertise and their own lived experiences, and that's like being able to listen and believe, right, and those that live in the margins of the margins.
Another mic drop or jewel, as we say, I would have called to men. Miranda, can we have the slides back up as we near closing? There's 2 things we want to offer with the slides. Thank you. If you could move to the next slide. So we said, you know, these were undeniable truths. We can't act like we don't know. Bottom line, we say that at a call to men all the time. You can try to lie yourself, but we're telling you right now that we know that you know now. So the 246 people that are here right now know this. And we hope that you ripple this out, that you create spaces where there's bravery to hold it down and come back, you know, because at the end of the day, our collective liberation is at stake. Before I move on, can we, someone verbally who's hearing me, Christina or Miranda, do we have 1 minute left? Is that correct? Right? Afua,
Done.
Yes.
You have 30 seconds for a jewel, and then I want to do something, please.
Jane lifted up Bernice Johnson Reagan's piece on coalition politics from 1981, which is always helpful to check out. Resources abound. There's a great documentary trending on Netflix I want to talk about called Disclosure. It helps us gain an idea of how we've been taught to respond to one another through the lens of transgender youth. And I just want to say, be easier on ourselves. Those of us whom I share affinity with on this call, we can be really hard on ourselves when we don't perform, can't show up, or just don't feel like it, and then think there's something wrong with us. That's normal. Our animal bodies have been cooped up for the last 7 months, and now we have to go through significant trauma memory for the next couple of days together. I think the other thing we got to do is remember, we've not been properly socialized to engage across lines of racial, ethnic, gender, and other difference. And so what we're learning here is how to repair relationships in this country. We are undoing racism, we are undoing anti-Blackness and anti-nativeness and so on and so forth, but we are repairing relationships because remember, science says we're all human.
Well, nothing but love for all of you for us to be in together. While we cannot see your faces, thank you, and nothing but love for the 251 people. We have a 14-second video to show you. Miranda, can you make that happen? We can't hear it. Let's try it one more time. Yep. Because we want Bree to come on board.
No justice, no peace. 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 No justice.
Look at her face. 8 years old, everybody. Look at her face. So if you can't do it, After hearing us, I'm begging you to do it for her and for millions and millions of little girls like her who are residing at the margins of the margins, all right? We just got to do it. We got to expand our lens. Nothing for love for all of you. Love must be served always. Don't act like we don't know. Woo! Thank you, team. Thank you, participants. We love being with you.
Thanks, Chucho and Jane. Yeah, I'll be getting in touch with them again.
Thank you so much for an amazing conversation. And we wish we'd have more time for these very important conversations. Thank you so much, Afua, Chucho, Jane, and Lina.
Mhm.